So given that we've talked about the types of false confessions, it's important to note how do we know anything about false confessions if they're so hard to observe and identify? Science has found two main ways to look at this, and that's through field or observational studies and empirical lab studies. So the one way to use field or observation type studies, in this instance, researchers examined previous known false confessions by viewing footage or interviewing the person who confessed. Richard Leo, who we'll get into some of his work, has done a lot of work on field type studies where he's watched many interrogations and collected data on them. So what variables are present during a case that involved a false confession, and then codes for them. Another way, which allows for more experimental control, are empirical lab studies. So researchers can manipulate the participants' innocence and guilt through the use of confederates. And they also can use various interrogation techniques, which we'll touch on later. But obviously the strength of field or observation studies is that it's ecologically valid, and so we know that they exist. However, doing studies empirically provides the sense of control, so we can more accurately pinpoint precisely what is happening that is inducing a false confession, and not a string of various confounds and other variables that might cause someone to be more likely to confess. So to get into more depth of the field evidence from Richard Leo and colleagues, it's worthwhile to note that people and students often ask how long police can hold suspects, and this issue is a little convoluted or confusing. Police can hold you for 24 hours without arresting you. If you are suspected of committing a serious or heinous crime, a magistrate and a magistrate is a type of judge, might allow for you to be held for 72 hours without being charged. This is a little fuzzy because people will come in voluntarily sometimes, and so it's not very clear as to when are they being held versus when are they just there out of their own volition. It's also unclear as to when the hold begins, so when do we start the 24-hour mark? Is this at Miranda or when they enter the building? This transition is hard to determine. But getting back to Richard Leo and Drizin, examining length of interrogation. So these researchers looked at characteristics involved with false confession. So all of this evidence all of the graphs I'm going to show in the next couple of slides are specifically related to people who have been found to have falsely confessed. So we know that their confession was false, and these are some of the variables that are related to that, trying to determine what's causing a false confession. So looking at this, Leo and Drizin determined that the average interrogation length for someone who's falsely confessed is more than 16 hours. So this is quite a long time to be asked very stressful questions and have a interrogator in your face through some of this. 16 and a half hours is a long time. And then they also found that the median time for that is 12 hours. Again, this is a long amount of time to be questioned. And to get into all of their data, they found that 16% of people were held for less than 6 hours. A large percentage of people, about a third of people, were held for 6 to 12 hours before they falsely confessed. And then the largest proportion of people who falsely confessed were held for 12 to 29 hours. And then next is 12 to 48 at 7%, and a small percentage at 4% are held longer than 48 hours. So the more time that the longer they're held, the more likely they are to falsely confess, because this is just causes greater physical and mental fatigue. It makes people feel isolated and uncertain of their own memory. So people generally are at greater risk of falsely confessing the longer the interrogation goes. And this also heightens the susceptibility to influence. So you have an interrogator who keeps saying, "Oh, I know you did it. I have the evidence. I know you did it. I know you did it." At some point, people become a little broken down and start to question their own memories. This also, the more time also impairs decision making abilities, so it becomes more difficult to discern what the consequences of confessing to a crime you didn't commit is. So with all of this in mind, the longer the interrogation, the more risky it is that the confession one would obtain is false. Leo and Drizin also looked at other variables that pertain to the individual themselves. So, what brings one to falsely confess? Are there variables that increase that likelihood? Leo and Drizin also looked at other characteristics that were related to false confessions, and one thing that they looked at specifically was age at confession, the one's sex or gender, and then case type. So what were they being accused of? In terms of age, you see that most people, 6% are under the age of 13, 30% are 14 to 17 years old. So that's 35% of people are not even legal adults yet. And then 18 to 24-year-olds constitute 27% of this. And then 25 to 39-year-olds hold the largest category at 31%. And then with older people, they constitute less of the demographic of false confessions. And part of this is partly due to fewer criminals after age 40. So that demographic is not necessarily suspected, but it's also indicative of individual differences in false confessions. So if you've taken any type of neuropsychology or cognitive psychology, you know that we're not fully developed, or that psychological maturity isn't reached until 25 to 30 years old. So it's here that you see most of this, and so that's part of it. And just as well as people get older, they commit fewer crimes. So more than half are under the age of 25. 92% are under the age of 40. That's a huge demographic of people that are very young. Additionally, Leo and Drizin did look at sex of false confessors and found that 93% of false confessors were male, which again is more so because men commit more crime and are interrogated more, but it may also be that women aren't as susceptible, or interrogators are not as psychologically harsh on women. So it's not really clear what's driving this specifically, but we do know that men commit much more crime than women, and so this is probably a main drive in why 93% of confessors were male. You can probably guess that case type matters as well, with most of those being murder cases. So a large percentage of people who confessed were accused of murder, which details that interrogators are more harsh in these higher stakes cases. They can be more justifiably deceptive because the consequences of not getting a confession are greater. The rest of this really comes from in small percentages in comparison, with 9% being rape cases and 3% arson. So aside from characteristics outlined by Leo and Drizin, other individual characteristics have been outlined as increased risk factors of false confession, but I want to make it perfectly clear that everyone is susceptible to false confession. I'm susceptible to false confession. You're susceptible to false confession. It's not a problem of certain individuals, although it might increase risks, some of these characteristics. It's not necessarily that if you don't fit in any of these categories, that you're not susceptible to a false confession. So individual characteristics that increase the risk of false confession. Juveniles are obviously more susceptible. As we saw in the previous slide, children are more compliant and eager to please, which also makes them more susceptible. One example that is in your book is that of George Stinney, who was accused of killing 2 white girls in 1944. He was interrogated for several hours without his parents, and the police promised him ice cream if he confessed. So he did confess. The only evidence at his trial was his confession, and he is the youngest person executed in the United States at the age of 14. Obviously, there are many variables that play into this case that we won't get into now, but the bottom line is that children are usually more susceptible, and then they're typically children are compliant and suggestible as well, which holding those personality traits as an adult makes you more at risk of a false confession. And then again, highly anxious, fearful, depressed, and psychologically disordered people are at higher risk of false confession. Not having any sort of anxiety disorder, interrogation is difficult enough. If you do have any sort of anxiety disorder, then it's even more incredibly difficult to get through say maybe a 12-hour confession, 12-hour interrogation. Additionally, intellectual disabilities might make you more susceptible to false confession. Of the 125 documented false confessions in Leo and Drizin's study, 22% of them had some sort of intellectual disability, showing that not necessarily everybody has this issue, but it's not a fact that we should just overlook. So about a quarter of people were deemed intellectually disabled who did falsely confess in the documented studies. Additionally, cognitive impairment might make you more susceptible to false confession. This could be drugs or exhaustion. Oftentimes, people don't tell police that they are under the influence of drugs or alcohol, which would maybe help in that they shouldn't be interrogated, but you're also, if you are on drugs, you are committing to another crime. But this can change how you make decisions, so as well as exhaustion. So if you come in tired and then you are held for a very long period of time, you're already tired. Many people go in after maybe being at work, and so they've worked for 8 to 12 hours, and now they have to be interrogated for however long. So all of these things might make someone more at risk of a false confession. Leo and Drizin also examined the harm caused by a false confession. So harm encompasses the idea that the system failed to successfully determine innocence when people were factually innocent. So the numbers are broken down for you in this visual with degree of deprivation of liberty, unsuccessful prosecutions, convictions, and sentences. So just different ways in which the system failed to recognize innocent people. Of particular importance in these findings, in these numbers, is the number of people who were convicted. 35% of people who confessed to crimes they didn't commit were ultimately convicted through jury or by taking plea bargains. Fortunately, the number of people who were unsuccessfully prosecuted or never charged is larger than the number who were convicted, but given that 44 people were still convicted out of this sample, that's 44 people who did not see justice. Additionally, 10% of unsuccessful prosecutions were a result of jury acquittals. This is good in that it's demonstrating that jurors sometimes can recognize false confessions, but not often. So they're not totally incapable of seeing when a confession is coerced or not true, but It's better than never having any acquittals with a confession at trial. Additionally, 32% of those convicted pled guilty. Additionally, of those convicted, 32% pled guilty, which is striking as plea bargains constitute more than 95% of criminal cases. So we do not know how many people who have pled guilty are not factually guilty. This process is incredibly difficult to try and appeal when you've taken a plea bargain, so it's not always as straightforward. Additionally, people who have pled or who have falsely confessed might have attorneys that are saying, well, you should take the plea bargain, which I wouldn't necessarily disagree with, given that confession evidence is so damning and jurors aren't always very good at determining what's a true and false confession. Additionally, 15% of the total false confessors were sentenced to die in prison, and this is through life sentences, life without parole, or the death penalty. So you see 19 of the 125 people would have died behind bars. Of those that were sentenced, they constitute 23 and 20% of that sample. Or some people estimate that the number of people wrongfully executed to be 1 in every 25, or 4.1%. So this could mean that approximately 120 of the roughly 3,000 inmates on death row in America right now might not be guilty. And there are currently 14 people who have not been who have been executed that are strongly believed to be innocent. So the harm that's associated with false confession and otherwise faulty trial outcomes is pretty high. We're talking about people's lives, and time is in essence that we cannot get back. In the next section, we'll talk about false confessions in the lab, and how we experimentally manipulate interrogation tactics to determine what causes guilty people to confess and what might increase false confession rates.